Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for this workshop on mitigating bias in assessment and strategies for promoting fair and equitable grading practices. Now, whenever I talk about this topic, I'm always a little sensitive because I don't want it to seem like I'm minimalizing bias in other areas of the educational experience. Any of you come to my other workshops or know me know that I'm deeply passionate about inclusive teaching strategies. So I'm not saying that it's okay to have a microaggression against somebody in the classroom, but let me say this. When it comes to assessment, I always say that's really where the rubber hits the road. Because if I say something to you in class that is offensive to you, it might hurt you, it might be a problem. And I'm not saying that's okay, but you might get over that. But if I use bias when I'm assessing you, that could deeply affect your ability to match the specialty that you go into, whether or not you get honors, and so on. It could detrimentally affect your career moving forward. So this is where I think it really makes a tremendous impact on our students. So I take this topic very seriously, and I appreciate that you took your time to join us today so that we could talk about it a little bit. And as always, we've got the disclosure slide saying that I have no financial interests or conflicts of interest to report. And I see a few new people here, and so welcome. If you haven't come to one of my workshops before, I'm so happy to have you today. I'm Rosemary Tyrrell. I'm the director of the Office of Faculty Development here at the UCR School of Medicine. And I also hold an assistant professor role in the Department of Social Medicine, Population, and Public Health. So I've been at UCR for about 8 years now in this position, and UCR was my first medical school. So that was a bit of a transition when I got here. But I've been doing teaching and faculty development for more years than I care to admit. And it's been my lifelong vocation and avocation. And it looks like we've got a few more people coming in. So let's make sure we get them in the room. Welcome everyone who's joining. So I'm going to start us off with a little activity. And now you're not going to be asked to share any of this. So you're on your honor to do it. I won't know whether you did it or not. But here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Take a piece of paper. Don't do this in your head. Take a piece of paper and a pen or pencil in hand. And I know if you're commuting or something, you can't do it. But if you can, and write down the initials of 6 people whom you trust, who are not members of your family. So just write their initials down real quick. And it doesn't have to be like, I trust this person with my life. It could just be someone I trust maybe to keep a secret if I told it to them, someone I trust fairly well. Just give you a minute to think about that and write down those 6 initials. And it's most effective if you actually physically write them down. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to read off different demographic dimensions. And all I'm asking you to do is just put a little tick mark, a little check mark next to the initials of anyone on your list who shares that with you. So for example, if I say gender, male participants would have put a tick mark besides all the men in their trusted 6, etc. So if we're ready, I'll begin, and we'll start with gender. So is this person the same gender as you? Check them off. How about ethnicity? Are they the same ethnicity as you? What about native language? Do they share the language that you grew up speaking in your home? How about nationality? Do they share the same citizenship that you share? And you may not know exactly from everybody, but make your best guess. You know, you're on a visa, they're on a visa. You're a citizen, they're a citizen, whatever that is. Age. And again, you may not know their exact age, but you got a pretty good idea if they're a similar cohort as you. You know, you're a baby boomer, they're a baby boomer, you're Gen X, they're Gen X. Professional background. So they share your professional interests. The next one is religion. And again, you may have to make some guesses here. You may not exactly know. So you might be broad. It might be, well, I believe, I'm a believer and they're a believer. They may go to a different church than me or a different synagogue. But there's some similarity there. And the last one is hobbies and interests. So you're really into surfing, they're really into surfing. You like baking, they're interested in that, whatever those hobbies and interests are. Do you share at least some of them with them? And now I just want you to take, and again, I'm not going to ask you to share any of this, but I just want you to take a look at that list and reflect on whether or not the people on that list share a lot in common with you when it comes to those demographic dimensions. And most people, when they do this exercise, are surprised at how similar the people on their circle of trust lists are to themselves. And so I just want to put that out there for you to give some thought to that as we proceed. Today, by the end of this session, I'm hoping that you'll have an opportunity to identify some problems with assessment bias, to develop some strategies for maybe mitigating bias in assessments, and to discuss inclusive practices in the form of assessment, in the area of assessment. So I have a question and you can unmute and just jump in, or you can put it in the chat or raise your hand, whatever works for you. So you're probably familiar with this concept of in-group, out-group bias, people who are like us, people who are not like us. So what are some implications of this in assessment? Any thoughts on that? This is a natural human tendency, in-group, out-group bias. How might that affect learners in forms of assessment? It's not a trick question. Nobody there willing to jump into the conversation? There we go.
I think we're all quiet because there's too much to say, honestly.
Okay, so give us one thing. What's one implication?
Uh,
Someone says we favor people who are like us. Go ahead,
yeah.
Dr.
Yeah, my name's Marla Arbelot. Hello, everybody. And I think just similar to like what Ozma's iPhone says, we favor people like us, but also because we favor people like us, if we don't feel like we're like them, we tend to even exclude ourselves.
Yep. And although we may be thinking that we're making objective assessments of merit and treating people fairly, hidden preferences for people like ourselves can cause us to give more positive assessments to people who are like us. And by the other extreme, maybe more negative assessments to the out group. And again, the outcomes of this are obvious. If individuals are from a group that is underrepresented in medicine, they're much more likely to be in the out group of the people who are doing the assessments. So, you know, they're trying to increase diversity in medicine, but that means, you know, there's not necessarily a balance there at all times. So they might have a harder time if they're in an out group. By definition, they're underrepresented. So they might have a harder time achieving top grades, achieving honors, or even passing a course or clerkship than their peers who are a member of an in-group. And that just compounds the problem, because now we're discouraging people who are in those, you know, historically marginalized groups that didn't have the same access to medical education. So again, this is something that we, you know, people are, well, I'm not biased, I'm not prejudiced. Nobody likes to believe they are, but in-group, out-group bias is natural. It's hardwired into our DNA. We can't help it. You know, people over there who were different than us represented a threat to our tribe, and people over here who looked like us and acted like us were safer to be around. That's just natural human behavior, and we all have it. So that's one of the first things to think about, is that we can't deny that these biases exist. So Lupin et
Do you
al.
think they're
Go ahead.
very subconscious, or do you think this is intentional?
No, I think it's often at the subconscious and unconscious level. It is working on us. We may not even be aware that it's working on us. And I think, intentional bias, that's a very different thing. That's intentional discrimination. But we're hopefully talking to people who, because they came to this workshop, aren't intentionally biasing anyone. They're not doing it on purpose. So here's a few key principles related to assessment, and which is a good place for us to start. So these are really thinking about diversity enriches the learning environment, that differences are not deficits. So I used to encounter this a lot when I was working with undergraduate educators who would say, I can't work with these students. They English isn't even their first language. And I used to tell them, think about that for a minute. What you're saying is that, so rather than seeing that as a positive, that somebody speaks more than one language, you're seeing it as a deficit. So again, difference is not a deficit. It enriches the learning environment, and that we all want our learners to succeed. That's why we're here. That's why we're educators. And assessment is a tool for learning, as well as a tool for evaluating their performance. And we have to be open to multiple ways of assessing our learners. And we also need to hold all our learners to the same high standards. So those are just some overriding principles that we want to think about. So one of the things to think about, and please feel free to jump in at any time if you have comments or questions. Assessment's always a balancing act. It always is. You may want the most meaningful assessments possible, but you don't want something that's going to be overly burdensome for faculty, for the learners, or for staff who have to manage it. So what can happen if an assessment tool is too time consuming? If I hand you an assessment, a grading sheet for a clerkship, and it's like 5 pages long, what might happen? Any thoughts about that? Again, unmute, put it in the chat, whatever you want. I'm not above calling on people. So what do you think, Dr. Lou? If I give you a really complicated assessment form to fill out, what's going to happen if faculty get that?
Yeah, I apologize. I just come back from vacation, so I'm actually trying to eat dinner here, but that's okay. And I think 5-page assessment, the most likely scenario is that people just won't fill it out, or if they fill it out, they'll just fill it out without thinking too much, and you'll get an invalid assessment. But
Right.
5 pages is just so long, most people generally won't do that because we're all very busy.
Right. They're going to take one look at it and they're going to say, heck with this. They either won't fill it out, or if they have to fill it out, they might straight line it, which is what we mean when somebody just goes down and says 33333. They don't even read it. They just mark it. And if they are dedicated enough to take the time to fill it out, we may end up with more data than we need. And too much data is just as bad as not enough data. Might be difficult now to decipher. It clouds the issues about both the learner's capabilities and our own teaching methods. So that's why we often rely on rubrics or other grading tools. The standards are clearly articulated, which provides some depth of the assessment, but they're also scaled, making it easier for people to grade and less time consuming than other methods of assessment. But again, it will never be perfect. It's always going to be this balancing act. So how objectives are assessments that claim to be objective? That's a good question. I'm really glad you asked that. There's no such thing as a truly objective assessment. There's no such thing. So if you hear someone say, but this test is objective, no, it's not. Someone selected the questions to be on that test. Someone wrote those questions, and there's always going to be a subjective element to it. It may be objective in that the way it's graded by machine, that if you marked C and C was right, then everybody gets it right. So in that, category, it's objective, but it is not really objective because human beings created it, and there's always going to be bias that creeps in. So we'll talk a little bit about that, about the kinds of biases that creep in. So it's always helpful for us to sort of define what we're talking about. And so academic assessment bias usually refers to assessments that are unfair. They unfairly penalize or impact students based on characteristics such as their ethnicity, their gender, their socioeconomic status, their religion, their place of origin, the way they dress, the way they speak, the way they wear their hair, anything that's affecting the grade that isn't really something that we are actually assessing. So what happens? So because my examples are all, of course, from a medical school, but these examples are found throughout the literature, not just throughout medical schools. So we know, for example, that underrepresented in medicine, students who are underrepresented in medicine get lower scores on major standardized gateway exams like the MCAT, fewer honors grades. And again, I put all the different studies here. So if you want the slides, you can look these studies up. Lower grades in all clerkships, independent of other metrics. So again, lower rates of alpha, omega, alpha membership, fewer standout or ability narratives in descriptive assessments. Often, one study showed that Black applicants were described more as being competent rather than having those outstanding. And another study showed that men were described using those standout adjectives more than their female counterparts. And non-native fluent English speakers of Asian descent received lower clinical communication scores than their counterparts. So this is all well documented. And let's look at some of the literature on this. In a 2021 study published in the Journal of Graduate Medical Education, Cooney et al. Found that male attendings scored women residents lower than male residents. A study published in the Journal of Internal Medicine showed the same gender bias. In a lit review published in the same journal in 2019 showed that 5 out of the 9 studies they reviewed showed statistically significant gender bias in resident assessment. And while there's currently quite a bit less literature on other forms of bias, such as ethnicity, socioeconomic, other forms of bias, what does exist in those categories show this exact same pattern. It's not surprising. We all know we live in a world that has certain biases built in. So I could do a whole session on the kind of biases that exist. We don't have time for that. You're likely familiar with some of these, but here are 3 that really are common, especially in the way assessors think about the learners. It's heartbreaking. Yes, it is. And the literature bears it out, which is, I always try to make that argument so that I'm not making this stuff up. It's really shown in the literature. The first is, of course, stereotypes. So if you inherently believe that women are more compassionate caregivers, you may rate them more highly on that criteria and likewise rate other genders lower. So that's a stereotype. And I'll talk a little bit more about positive stereotypes a little bit later. And then, of course, there's anchoring and confirmation bias, which I know some of you are very familiar with. So that first impression you have, that's an anchoring bias. That's formed. And after that point, the assessor is now only noticing things that confirm their original impression. That's the confirmation bias. For example, you judge them on day 1 as not being very good, no matter how much they improve and no matter how much they have better days, they just can't seem to do anything right in that assessor's eyes. So that's anchoring bias, and usually backed up with confirmation bias. Because now that I think that you're this, I'm only seeing examples of that. I'm not seeing the contraindicated examples. This is somewhat of a similar issue, which is what we call the halo and horn effect. That's where a learner excels in one competency, so they end up getting rated in other competencies more highly than they actually deserve, and vice versa. a learner does poorly in one area, but actually is doing really well in the other competency areas, and they get graded more poorly because of that. So they're either good overall or they're bad overall. Sometimes they're not getting graded fairly on which competencies they really excel in and which ones that they are struggling in. And then, of course, fundamental attribution bias, which I know you all remember very clearly from your Psych 101 class. I'm joking, nobody ever remembers this. It's the tendency that people have to overemphasize characteristics in others and ignore situational factors, and then to do the opposite for ourselves. So, for example, if I was late to work today, it was because there was a lot of traffic, my alarm didn't go off, and my laundry wasn't folded. Situational factors. If you were late to work today, it was because you're a disorganized person who isn't very professional. So you notice that for me, it was a situation that caused me to be late, but for you, it was a flaw in your character. That's fundamental attribution bias. And again, it's very natural. We tend to do this all the time. So those are three. I could talk about a lot more, but those are three that really impact assessment. Participants in one study worried that stereotypes were influencing their evaluations. So they said they struggled with openly displaying their identities. Some learners said they modeled their supervisor or preceptor's behaviors and identities, believing that would lead to a more positive assessed outcomes. Now, that may seem like, what's the big deal? So they're modeling their preceptors. Isn't that a good thing? Not if they're not being their authentic self and they're hiding who they are because they're afraid they're going to be discriminated against. That's a problem. And a lot of people in this study admitted to trying to hide who they were because they didn't want that to be used against them. So there are a few types of testing bias. So we're not going to talk that much about testing bias, but I did want to touch on it. So there's basically a few types of testing bias. We'll talk about three. The first one is a construct bias. That's when items that are measured are not universal. So someone new to the country may have a really good understanding of geography overall, but may be unfamiliar with some geographical features that in the US that would be common knowledge to people who grew up in this country. So that's one. The way the test is created creates questions about things that may not be universal to all learners. There's also something called method bias. That refers to the way the assessment is administered. For example, a large percentage of a grade may be based on a final exam, which favors students with good test-taking skills over students who may know the content equally well, but would do better on an oral exam. And it's the same question that I always have about what percentage of the written final, meaning the MCQ test, and what percentage should be based on the OSCE, which is the clinical exam. The next item, type of testing bias that we frequently see is item bias. So that's a way that a testing item itself is written that can incorporate bias. So if the context of the question includes vocabulary that's unfamiliar, it favors students, again, who are native to the area over students who may not be familiar with certain expressions or ways of saying things. Here's an example. I usually do this face-to-face, so I always point to someone and say, what do you call that strip of land between the street and the sidewalk? You live in a house, you've got a yard, and then there's a sidewalk, and then there's a little tiny bit of land, and then the street. And I'm not going to ask you to respond to that because where I grew up, we called it the Devil Strip. And I was really quite old before I realized that other people never heard of that expression. So if I wrote in a test, neighbors are having a dispute over the Devil Strip adjoining their property, anyone who didn't grow up in Eastern Ohio would no idea what I was talking about. I thought everybody called it that. But that's an extreme example. But language and the way we use language such as this often works its way into test questions, and it may build bias into the equation. And Asma, I don't know if you were wanting to jump into the conversation or there was just, you were talking to someone else. Okay, so I'm not going to read all this, don't worry, but I wanted to just provide this example. These are examples from medical education, wherein the standards to evaluating assessment are compared to ways in which inequities and biases can occur. So just, this is talk about one, and that's validity or coherence. So assessment tools, are they measuring what they're intended to measure? So does it have construct validity? And is it used for the purpose for which it's intended? So the numeric results of a licensing exam, an NBME type exam, is designed to ensure minimal competence in medical knowledge. And any of you who've ever been on the admissions committee knows that this conversation comes up a lot around the MCAT, right? Is it a valid test? There's been a lot of research done on this. And is it actually measuring what it's supposed to measure? The GRE, for those of you who aren't in clinical medicine, the GRE, same questions have been raised, because what's the purpose? The purpose of the graduate records exam or the MCAT exam or the LSATs for law school are all intended to determine how successful you will be in graduate school, in medical school, or in law school. The research doesn't bear that out. There's very little correlation to scores on those tests and, well, how well someone survives their graduate school experience. Now, medical school, I don't know. I may be wrong on that. There may be great correlation, but I've seen it used really heavily in admissions when, it's at least we should be asking the question, is this a valid assessment? And is it a fair and valid assessment? So this is a broader view taking into consideration of something called the sociological model, which looks at issues of bias in assessment from the learner level, the very basic level, all the way up to the society level. I won't read this, but it is available in the slides. But if you look at it, we're looking at the learner, what's the susceptibility to stereotype threats or microaggressions, all the way up to the society level. Are there national policies and legal decisions governing things like economics, education, criminal justice, housing, health disparities, and so on that are affecting that person's ability to succeed? That may seem a little esoteric, but I will include it in the slides. If you want a copy of the slides, it's there if you want to look at it a little more closely. I'm going to skip over our case study, and come back to that if we have time. So, because I don't want to take too much time before we talk about what do we do about it, because that's what you're here for, right? How do we mitigate this kind of bias so we're treating our students in an equitable manner? So when we use the word bias, we tend to think in terms of avoiding treating someone who is not like us unfairly. However, bias creates problems on both sides of the equation. It can cause us to treat someone unfairly who is different from us, but it can also lead us to grade inflation by giving too much benefit of the doubt to students or learners who have not earned that because they are like us. Either direction is problematic because it introduces problems within the assessment system and unfairness. So again, as I touched on this briefly before, even a quote unquote positive bias, it's still a stereotype. So again, using my earlier example, if I say women are better nurturers, so they have better bedside methods, what am I also saying? Again, not a trick question. If I'm saying that women are better, then I'm saying men are not as good, right? That men are worse, right? Exactly. So if I go in with that anchoring bias in my head, then again, I add into that my confirmation bias. So every time I see, a female resident being kind and caring, I'm saying, see, women are better nurturers. And I'm looking for evidence that supports my preconceived idea. So even though so-called positive bias is still hurting, it's still hurting all the learners. And to avoid bias, we try to follow some simple ideas. So these are mostly actually just best practices in grading generally, but they particularly apply to avoiding bias in grading. So what does equity actually look like? So equity in assessment is present when all students have a fair and impartial opportunity to learn, to be evaluated, coached, etc., based on their demonstration of achievements rather than who they are. That's a long-winded way of saying something that you probably already thought of. So again, we talked about the components of bias that might exist. We also talked a little bit about the test elements. Let's talk about the components of equity in assessment. So intrinsic equity, I don't know why I'm stumbling over my words today. The design of the assessment and the assessment tools are used to mitigate against bias, against groups that are historically marginalized. So looking at the equity issues in the instrument itself. And then contextual equity. So that's fairness in the learning environment where the assessment is being given. So this would include fairness in how tasks are assigned, what supports are available, and other factors that influence that learner's ability to show their competency. So some learners are getting more opportunities to do a certain procedure. Naturally, they're going to score higher on that procedure than learners who may have been overlooked and not given as many opportunities. So again, that's what we would call contextual equity. It's like, people are thinking, well, I'm only judging based on how well they did it. But did they have the equal opportunity to get as good at it? That's a contextual equity. And then, of course, we talked a little bit about this instrumental equity. How are the results used and shared? And equity exists when results are shared and used in a manner that neither over or under predict subsequent performance. In other words, the assessments in one area don't create an anchoring bias in the minds of the assessor or other assessors. So this is a big conversation when I was on the professionalism committee, and there's somebody in the room who's also on that committee, about, do you want to tell people, well, this person was up, had been pulled in for professionalism? Because if I say that to their next course faculty member or their next clerkship rotation director, that creates an anchoring bias in that individual. So now they're looking, oh, this is a problem student. The idea of, do you warn people that someone's coming? And this, again, this has been studied extremely in elementary education, where it showed very detrimental effects. So someone comes in, they're self-fulfilling prophecy, right? You see everything bad about that person if you were told that individual is a troublemaker or that individual is a low performer. That's been shown with a ton of research behind it. One of the first questions we want to ask is, what exactly are we assessing? Are we assessing the quality of the work? How well someone did the task? A completion of a set of tasks. So how many tasks did they check off the list? Sometimes OSCEs are evaluated that way. Did they wash their hands? Did they introduce themselves? Did they do this? Did they do that? Or are we assessing based on standards which have been set by the program, competencies? So how are those standards set is a question that's rarely asked. This is the gold standard, of course, to be competency-based, but you also have to be mindful about how those competencies were developed. And so those are perfectly valid ways of assessing, or are we assessing on how much the learner is like us? Did they do it the way I would have done it? We get complaints about this in OSCEs all the time, by the way, that students get marked down because the clinician who's grading them is grading them because they didn't do it the way they do it in their practice, but they did it the way they were taught in medical school here at UCR. So again, are they following the procedures as they were taught is what we should be assessing, not, well, that's not how we do it in my clinic. So are we judging someone's way of speaking? Are their appearance, their style of dress? Of course, unless it crosses into the line of professionalism, which may be part of what we're assessing. But if it's not, they shouldn't be affecting our evaluation. But biases creep in, we're humans. So we need to remain aware and vigilant to what those biases might be and how they might be influencing us. And again, so that's step one. We have to recognize that bias can influence inferences. So educators develop immediate impressions from the very moment they begin working with that learner, often based on very limited information. Many feel that they can make these judgments quickly. So, what we call system one thinking, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is really based in instinct, snap judgments, mental shortcuts. That's where implicit bias lives. So the literature suggests that these rapid judgments occur unconsciously, but they influence future interactions and future decision making. So we've got to be aware of that. And the other one, again, a lot of these are just good grading practices in general. We have to have clear standards and competencies and make sure those standards and competencies are clearly communicated to the learners. All assessment should be transparent and open to feedback. I've talked about this many times in meetings that we had, I think it's changed, but for a while we had 25% of a clerkship grade was professionalism, but there was no consensus on what we were evaluating in that category. What does that even mean? They showed up in a clean white coat. They showed up on time. What are the criteria? So if I'm a student, how do I know what I'm supposed to do? And it is, if it's unclear, it's unfair. So, and again, we're trying to create criterion-based standards. But no matter how carefully assessments are aligned with our learning outcomes and how carefully the instruments are designed, there's still a possibility of norm referencing in the mind of the assessor, which can lead to bias. Now I'm using EduSpeak, but I'll explain this more as we move forward. So keeping grading strictly based on the criteria is a cognitive challenge, but it can be extremely beneficial and it can be done. It just requires a little bit of mental processing. So once upon a time was a different institution, not here, and the instructor I work with admitted that she assigned the grade first, and then she went back and filled out the rubric and made sure it added up to be the grade that she'd already given. So her reasoning was, I know a B student when I see one. What can I say? That's a huge red flag, right? Because clearly that could be very biased. So you've made, what should we be using one type of thinking in all our assessments? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because again, that can absolutely bias some students. And that whenever possible, consider if there are holistic assessment methods that could be incorporated. So that's a comprehensive approach. We say we have holistic assessments in our admissions process, and to some degree we do. And the chair of that committee tries very hard to make sure that we're not overemphasizing grade point average and MCAT scores, and that we're looking at other things, distance traveled, mission fit, other aspects. So a holistic assessment is a comprehensive approach. So it takes into account their cognitive skills, their emotional skills, their communication skills, their technical skills. Its primary purpose here is to get an understanding overall of that learner's strengths and weaknesses. That's the purpose of a more holistic assessment. Not always possible in every circumstance, but whenever possible is always good and a valuable way of trying to reduce bias. Whenever possible, try to base assessments on multiple observations of the learner if you're in a clinical setting, or if you're in a classroom setting, multiple sources of information, such as, you don't make 95% of their block score the final exam. So that's one all-important assessment. Nothing else counts for anything. So again, supporting your narrative assessment with specific examples of both positive behaviors and areas for improvement. If you're in a clinical environment, is it possible to have other clinicians and staff observe the learner and ensure that the assessments are used as feedback from multiple observers on multiple occasions? So you don't want it to just be one instance either, because maybe that person was just having a really bad day that day. We all have bad days. And again, whenever possible, I recognize the limitations in the clinical environment, and some of our faculty have difficulty even observing the student once while they're on rotation, let alone multiple times, but whenever possible. Ideally, again, you want assessments to be completely transparent. So what do I mean by that? I mean that learners understand exactly what they're going to be assessed on, not just what, but how they will be assessed. What will the criteria be that is used to determine that grade? And just a little aside here, I always laugh when people say, but we don't have grades in medical education. Oh yeah, you do. You have in clerkships, you have pass, high pass, honors, and fail. I don't know about you, but I'm an education person. To me, those are grades. And we do have just pass fail in pre-clerkship at UCR, but it's still a grade, a P or an F, right? It's a grade. So it's helpful to communicate to the learners. What's the difference? If it's on a 5-point scale, what's the difference between a 3 and a 5? So again, if I'm grading professionalism, what qualifies someone to get the 3? What qualifies, even more importantly, what qualifies someone to get the 5? How can I perform at that level if I don't know what my target is? Has to be transparent. It also helps keep you honest, because if you can't justify to the learner why they scored a 4 instead of a 5 on a specific area or specific criteria, perhaps that's a problem. If you can't explain to them why they got the 4, then it could be based on things other than the criteria. So it's not necessarily that you were using bias, not necessarily, but it's a sign that you need to address shortcomings in your process, whether that's improving the actual instrument or improving the process that you use. You should be able to point to real things that caused you to give them that 3 or that 2 or whatever, especially if you're giving them a 1 or a 5 on a 5-point scale. So if someone was like the worst and you gave them the worst score possible, you got to explain that. You can't just give somebody a 1 and walk away. I think now on our clerkship assessment tool here at UCR, it's a requirement that you put something in the narrative box. If you give someone a 1, same thing on the other end. If they, jumped over buildings with a single bound, why did they earn the 5? Because that's pretty high bar for most students who are still learning, after all, to hit. So if they did, why did they? And again, that helps keep you honest from favoring students that you just like or that are like you. So again, that's why we create those. So, and again, avoid relative comparisons. And I've had faculty say, oh, we don't do that here. We don't do what in EduSpeak is called norm reference grading. In the real world, often people call it grading on a curve, which means comparing people within a cohort. But it creeps in mentally, even if it's not part of the actual official system. So for example, a preceptor observes a student with very poor skills and then observes a learner with marginal skills. There's a good chance that they're going to give them a higher score, that second learner, than is justified by their actual performance. Why? Because in their mind, they're making that comparison whether they meant to or not. The opposite is also true, right? Someone observes a learner who is just top of their class, who's outstanding. And then they observe a learner who's doing pretty well, but isn't, that outstanding stellar student. They may end up grading them more harshly because of the unconscious comparison to the other learner. So rather than comparing them to the standards or the criteria, they're, mentally, they're making that comparison whether they intended to or not. I hear faculty say it all the time. We're competency-based. Good. That's the best way to grade. That's the idea. However, at the same time, we're human beings. And these types of things can detrimentally affect the learner who was treated less than fairly. It takes cognitive focus to make sure those things aren't creeping in. And treating everyone the same isn't the same thing as treating everyone fairly. Every learner should have a level playing field and an opportunity to succeed, and some learners may need accommodations. So, for example, creating accommodations for learners with special needs, it's leveling the playing field for them. So an example, if in a classroom environment, is if you have a learner with a diagnosed learning disability, a reasonable accommodation for taking NBME style shelf exam might be to give the learner more time or provide a distraction-free room for them to work. And not only are these accommodations reasonable, it's the law, it's part of the American with Disabilities Act. So learners with a bona fide special need must receive what they call reasonable accommodation. And the courts have generally defined reasonable as what a reasonable professional in that field would consider reasonable. So here would be an example in a clinical environment. Providing a way for a learner with mobility challenges to do a cardio exam is likely going to be considered reasonable. We'll just find a way for them to do it. Allowing a learner with mobility challenges to skip doing the cardio exam is likely not going to be considered reasonable by a reasonable professional. So what can we do to make sure that everyone has this opportunity to demonstrate their skills, abilities, their knowledge? How do you maintain a consistent and fair grading process? So there are a number of ways to do this. I teach and have taught writing for many years, and I found myself getting cranky after about 5 papers. So I had to chunk them up into different times, because it's not fair that a student who's number 10 in the pile somehow gets graded more harshly than the person who was lucky enough to be on the top of the pile. So it may be that you have to take breaks while you're doing the grading to make sure that your grading is consistent. It may be that once you start seeing a problem that you didn't catch the first part of your assessment, that you have to go back and reassess those earlier projects, assignments, or whatever. When it comes in a clinical environment, you might, instead of waiting until the evaluation is due and you have to sit down and fill out that grading form, you might try keeping brief notes while observing the learner's work. And then when it comes time to evaluate, you have a lot more data to go on. And I always encourage this. And I think that the key to doing this well is keep those notes super, super short and use your own forms of abbreviation so you know exactly what you said. Or you create a monster that's going to take too much time and effort. You don't want pages and pages and pages of notes that you now have to go through when it's time to fill out the rubric. But you do want to have something valid that you can look at and say, oh, right, I remember that incident. And again, use what we call in EduSpeak a rubric. Most people outside of education call it a grading sheet. Which is a rubric is a grading instrument that you probably are familiar with. It's usually a Likert scale with different performance markers detailed in each category. So, down the side are the categories that we're going to be evaluating, and across the horizontal axis are the different criteria based on the level of evaluation. So one of the purposes of a grading rubric is reducing grading bias in either direction. So it can be particularly helpful on the positive side. So it's harder to give someone a 5 out of 5 when they don't honestly fit the description in that box. Pretty hard to justify it then. And if a rubric was provided to you as, clerkship or whatever, please, I'm begging you, read the descriptions in the box. I know it takes time. But using heuristics, on a scale to 1 to 5, I think there are 3. That's the surest way to invite bias into the process. Use the actual criteria and read through it carefully to see if that actually matches their performance. And I know that takes more time, but you need to. At the very minimum, if you're so rushed that you just don't have time to read every category, read 5 and read 1. So what is the optimal performance and what is the minimal performance? So that you at least have some idea of where those ranges fall. I think ours is 1 to 5. Correct me if I'm wrong. Those of you who are grading, especially in the clerkships, know that. So information, using qualitative and quantitative information. You do this, I know in clinical, we have both the score and the narrative assessment, often that goes into their MISP. So again, we want that narrative assessment coupled with the quantitative assessment. Be mindful that depending on qualitative information you're using, it is obviously subjective, so that needs to be done really carefully and worded really carefully. I know a lot of our faculty have told me straight out that because they've been resident directors themselves, they never put anything negative in the MISP because they know it's going to hurt that person's chances of matching. It's a problem within the system, but I can certainly understand where they're coming from. The idea of giving narrative feedback, constructive feedback, is to improve someone's performance, not to pigeonhole them so that they can't get matched or can't go into a certain specialty. That's not the purpose. But if that's how it's being used, I don't blame faculty for being cautious. Have the learner complete a self-evaluation prior to your assessment, and then review it and discuss any discrepancies between their self-assessment and yours. One of the places where this could be most effective is the mid-clerkship assessment tool that you have to do. Have them fill it out first and then have them send it to you. And then you can look at it against yours and talk about where they may be overestimating the abilities or where they may be too hard on themselves. Turn those forms of assessment into a discussion that sounds and feels like a discussion between colleagues, wherein you're providing them valuable feedback and not just handing them. I had a student tell me once, people were patting themselves on the back in a meeting about how we have 100% compliance on our mid-clerkship assessments. And she came to me after the meeting and said, yeah, that's all sounds really great. But you walk into the office and someone shoves a paper across the desk and said, here's your assessment. That's not what we want to see. So how valuable is it? Yeah, 100% of people are doing it, but is it really serving the purpose it's meant to serve? One activity that I have personally done is using small peer groups to grade de-identified work from previous cohorts. So I used to do this in a class I taught. I had large projects. So at the beginning of the process, I brought in projects that students had given me permission to use, and they were de-identified. Then I handed out the rubric to all the students that would be used to judge their work. And I had small groups get together and review different projects and assign a grade based on the rubric. I found that the students tended to be harsher graders than I was, but then I compared their grades to the grades I had actually given the projects, and I made sure there was a range of projects. So some groups could see what an exemplary project looked like. Some could see what an unacceptable project looked like. Some could see what a C mid-level project looked like and why one got one grade and one got another. I found that the students, as I said, tend to be harsher, but when we discussed the nuances of what caused the project to be top scoring, middling, or poorly scored, that did wonders for helping the learners better understand how their projects would be evaluated. And they consequently normally did far better than students had done in that class before I started using that activity. So you may not have occasion to do something as formal as that. I'm just trying to illustrate that learners need not only to, you can give them, put the rubric on your syllabus, but do they fully understand that criteria and how it will be used? Are there any ways you can show them exemplary work or exemplary behaviors that you're now going to be evaluating? It may not be possible in every situation, but when it is, yes, that students use the evaluation for feedback and rather than just for residency applications. I think they've changed our rubric so that you can make constructive feedback but put it in a box where it is not included in the MISP. So that way we kind of have the best of both worlds. We sort of keep the MISPs positive to give them better chance of matching, but constructive. But that opens up a whole nother discussion about whether we're being fair to residency programs if we're not being, totally honest about that student's performance level. That's a bigger discussion. Another one is something that, may or may not be possible in medical education, but is a blind assessment. So that's when the assessor doesn't know who performed the work. So, obviously you could do this with written assignments by giving them codes and de-identifying the papers. Here's an example though, from the real world. Many orchestras now place a screen behind which the musicians can play for their auditions. When they started doing this at first, the number of women who were hired increased from 6% to 21%. Now, that may not seem like much of an increase, but given the low turnover rate in symphonic orchestras, it's actually huge. So some studies have had some different results with blind assessment. So and have shown no statistical differences when grading blind. So the jury may still be out on this one, but is it possible to do it in some circumstances? Is there a benefit to doing it in some circumstances? Another one that may or may not be possible at all times is pair assessment or pair grading. So this is when you ask a colleague to grade on the same encounter and see if they come up with the same conclusion. While there'll always be some individual differences, it can help ensure you're not totally off base. And I'm not suggesting that you'd be able to do this on a regular basis. Obviously people don't have time for that. But even doing it maybe once or twice a year can be very revealing, and it can be a useful technique for, again, keeping you honest in your assessments. So, did I say once or twice a week? I meant once or twice a year. If I said week, that's not what I meant. Even just once or twice a year can make a difference. And again, some schools have instituted assessment committees that rely on a group rather than individuals to make high stakes summative decisions about advancement and graduation, committees that of course include diverse representation themselves. And we obviously do this in our admissions committee. That's not one person, it's a group of people who are themselves diverse who are making these decisions. So there's 3 critical elements of optimal committee structure. So one is group membership. A group invites the opportunity to implore the wisdom of the crowd. Armed with a large number of data points, draw on a diversity of opinions, and make well-considered decisions. And we know from research that diverse groups outperform individuals or homogeneous groups because members strengthen the quality of decisions made if the members are diverse. So that's a model that sometimes can be used. Another element is data management. The quality of the data available and the ease of accessing well-organized information strengthen group decision-making. Absent well-rounded data from multiple sources, group members may default to making decisions based on limited information or first impressions. So again, that introduces the risk of bias. And then the decision-making procedures. Structured procedures for data review and group discussion help ensure that all learners are evaluated based on the totality of information available. And again, a good example of this is the way our admissions committee works. The chair ensures that each candidate is presented given the exact same amount of time. They give them the same amount of discussion time and exactly the same criteria. And nobody says, well, I'm going to score them this way. Everybody scores individually, and then they compare the different scores. So it's a group decision making. And we don't have group think or people trying to influence each other. To some degree, the person presenting is sometimes advocating for that individual, but that's true of every presentation. So everyone's being treated fairly. Another is something called a norming activity. So this is where a group of people evaluate work individually and then compare notes to see if they're grading similarly. So for example, when I've done these with groups, we show a video maybe, and we have this video actually of a learner presenting a patient, and the individuals then grade the learner individually based on the rubric. Then everyone compares notes and discusses why they graded a particular way. So that allows us as a group to norm, like what a 3 looks like, what a 5 looks like. This is especially helpful within departments, and it can be done like in a department meeting or in a faculty development session, because, you know, we're always looking for making sure that people aren't being disadvantaged because they're over here at this site where the person grading is really harsh, or someone's over here at this site where the person's very generous and everybody over there is making honors and nobody over here is making honors. A norming activity can help balance that out. So again, useful, very useful. And even if you just do it like once a year, it can be very beneficial. And of course, training about biases brings awareness to our vulnerability for cognitive shortcuts and personal preferences. So UCR mandates bias training before you can serve on either an admissions committee or a hiring committee. Unfortunately, it doesn't mandate it for grading. And again, certain tools, so faculty development, we touch base on that, certain coaching strategies, and certain strategies and technologies to collect and display data on learner progress for learners, both for learners and the preceptors and faculty members who are evaluating them. We find, for example, the strengths and opportunities report that we generate from ExamSoft is quite useful, both for the students, our medical students, and for the learning specialists who may be working with them to improve their. If you have great tools that you're using at your institution, please share them in the chat so everybody can benefit from that. So I'm going to touch on System 1 and System 2 thinking for just a minute. And some of you may have read this excellent book, Thinking Fast and Slow. But for those of you who are unfamiliar with this work, just imagine. I'm going to ask you to imagine something. Say you live in a big city and you take the subway to work every day. You walk to the subway, you get on the same train, you get off at the same station, and you walk to your place of business. That's all System 1 thinking. You don't have to spend too much cognitive energy thinking about it. And if your mind wanders, you're still likely to get on the right train, get off at the right station, and not get lost when you go from the station to work. Now, imagine that you walk to your usual subway stop and you're confronted with a sign that says the subway is shut down due to some kind of mechanical failure. So what happens now? You stop and you think about, what am I going to do, right? Do I take a bus? Where's the bus stop? I don't know where it is. When does the bus come? When will the bus get me to where I'm going? Is it too far for me to walk to work? If I walk, will I be late? How late will I be? What would a rideshare cost? Do I have that app on my phone so I can call an Uber? So you're reasoning through all your options. So say, for example, you pick the bus option, for instance. It's likely you're going to pay very close attention to the time the bus comes. You're going to make sure you get on the right bus, and you're going to watch carefully for the stop where you have to transfer or get off. That's all System 2 thinking. It requires greater cognitive energy and greater focus and decision making. So System 1 thinking is immediate, and it's involuntary. It happens with minimal effort. If I say 1 + 1 =, you think 2. You can't help it. You don't need to think about it. It's involuntary. You can't avoid knowing that. System 2 thinking requires more attention and focus. But System 2 sometimes takes what we identify in System 1 and uses that knowledge to form judgments, make choices, and reason things out. So here we are, we're in higher education, we're in healthcare, we're all highly educated, highly smart people. We like to think we're all System 2 thinkers, that we consider things very carefully and reason them out. We're intellectuals after all. System 2 forms judgments and makes choices. However, System 2 sometimes endorses and rationalizes ideas and emotional feelings that were generated in System 1. In other words, System 1 is where bias lives. To further complicate things, people who are cognitively busy, which we all are more likely to take system one shortcuts and more likely to make selfish choices, use biased language, and make superficial judgments. So system one thinking is adept at creating causal connections between things, even when those causal connections don't really exist. And doctors must be good at system one. They have to be. It's a professional skill that you have to have. You have to be able to recognize certain illness scripts and, be able to make decisions quickly. And so they get good at certain types of system one thinking. The danger is thinking that you're good at system one thinking in all areas of life. And that's not true. So think about that when you're thinking about assessment. Are you really using that cognitive energy to think it through? Or are you just allowing system two to justify what you already decided in system one? So I hope that's not too off topic. And I know we're getting close to time. So I just want to go over some grading practices. So are the criteria that you're using inclusive? Are there biases present in the actual criteria that you're giving preferences to some students over others? And I talk a lot about this in my workshop on inclusive teaching generally. So selecting the right and reasonable assessment tool and strategies, which provide students with the best opportunity to demonstrate their own skills, knowledge, and learning. Very important. And moreover, I hate reading from slides, but I just usually ask someone else to read it. Moreover, it empowers students to self-direct their learning because there's a way that gets them excited about being able to demonstrate. And then, do the learners have access to all the resources they need to hit that criteria? Or do some learners have more access to those resources than others? So that's a question that we need to consider when we're trying to put inclusive practices together. So if we're providing study guides and study aids, are all students able to get those, or only students who can afford third-party resources that they're buying on their own? And some students may have more resources than others. And then, really important to me, because I do all the curriculum mapping for the School of Medicine, is the curriculum itself supporting the learners to achieve the competencies that we're evaluating them on? So in EduSpeak, we call this alignment. So you've got certain learning objectives. That's what they're expected to know or be able to do. You call some of those things RCEs and clerkships, right? Required clinical experiences. But then, are you teaching that information? So if I say they're supposed to do X, am I teaching X? And then assessment, how will they be assessed on that knowledge and skills? So, we want them to all be aligned. So I'm teaching X. They know they're supposed to learn X. I'm teaching X, and they know they're going to be tested on X. All that should be aligned. We shouldn't be assessing them on anything we haven't fully prepared them for. And are the structures we have in place helping reduce or increase bias? For example, could we move a larger percentage of the grade from a structured exam like an NBME shelf exam and put more focus on an objective clinical exam like an OSCE? Would that be a good thing? Do we have structures in place with the percentages we're assigning to different categories? So oftentimes people create it. I've seen this so many times in my practice. People create a rubric, and if there's 5 criteria, they make the rubric worth 25 points, 5, 5, 5, 5. It's like, well, okay, if they're all equal, fine, but are they? Or did you that was just easier to do? So, is it, and these days you don't even have to do the math. The sheets will do it for you. You can say, I want 10% to be here, 15% to be there, 30% to be here. It'll all add it up, no matter how many points are given to that assignment. There's systems that are really good at doing that. So are there structures in place that mitigate bias and allow all students a level playing field to be successful? All right, so that kind of brings us to the wrap up. So we talked a little bit about problems with assessment bias. We talked a little bit about some strategies for mitigating a bias, and we discussed some inclusive practices. I want you to think about this, and I'm gonna come back to this. So I want you to think about what was the most significant or surprising thing that you took from today's session, and what sort of questions remain in your mind that you would like to think more about after today's session? And then what would you like to share? And I usually end with, what's one thing that you will put into practice in your practice? So I didn't put that on my slide, but I'm going to come back and I'm going to ask you to reflect on that. And before we end, I would like to do a little commercial for our upcoming programs. So we've got a lot of great things coming up. We have an AI workshop, believe it or not, on assessments called Smart Assessments, Leveraging AI to Enhance Assessment Quality. And that's happening on April 16th. It's at lunch and it's in person and you will be given lunch. On the 7th, we have something for our administrative fellows learning series on fundraising and development. This is more geared towards staff and especially early career staff. So less for faculty. I mean, everybody's welcome if you're just interested, but that's the audience it's geared for. On the 24th, I'll be doing a session on the science of effective teaching, practical tools for medical educators, as part of the substance abuse disorders program that I'm involved in with Lisa Fortuna as the PI on that project. And on the 7th of May, we'll be doing a session called From Inbox to Impact, Communicating with Clarity and Purpose. Again, that's more geared to staff. Everybody's welcome, but that is more of a staff training program. I also want to encourage you that consider the Teaching Excellence Academy. Now, if you don't know about the Teaching Excellence Academy, you should, because the Teaching Excellence Academy is our flagship program. And right now we're recruiting for cohort 8. So we've been doing it for 7 years. It's been a highly successful program. It is competitive. So you have to apply and you have to be nominated. And then a committee makes a decision. Don't let that intimidate you, because the process for applying and the process for getting nominated are very straightforward. You can just send us an application and say, I'd like Dr. Luda to nominate me. We'll reach out to them and say, hey, so-and-so would like a nomination. Can you nominate them? It's very straightforward. This is a small group community of practice approach for taking a deep dive into teaching and learning. So it goes a lot deeper than what you're going to get in any one or a couple of workshops. It's a much more intensive program. It's year-long, but we don't meet for the entire year. We meet for part of the year, and then we work on other things. I'm trying to remember, Nana, remind me if I'm wrong, what the deadline is for this year. We're in the active recruiting cycle. We take applications all year, but we're in the active recruiting cycle right now. The committee will usually gets together sometime in late June or early July. We notify the people who were chosen in August, and the program starts in September. So if you want information, more information on what is involved, what's the commitment, how do I get in, I'm happy to give you more information on that. And I should have had oh, you did it already. I was going to say I should have had the link ready to put in the chat, but as usual, my wonderful support people are way ahead of me. Now I want to go back and ask you, for those of you who are remaining, what is one takeaway? What is one surprising thing or interesting thing that you're going to take away from today's session? Again, you can put it in the chat, but I would love it if you just unmute and share. How about you, Dr. DeBay? Can you share it with us?
Yes, I was about to do so.
You know, I'm not above calling on people. I'm old school when it comes to teaching.
Can you hear me well?
I can hear you very well.
Yeah, so I think the first comment is that I was really impressed by the extent of the presentation and to see how much work has been done on that issue.
Mhm.
That's very useful and instructive. But on the other hand, for me, and from my experience in participating in education program, the main problem is to how to do the assessment in the first place.
Right.
There's so many times where it's obviously non-valid, I would say, or irrelevant. So, of course, in those conditions, the bias might be even worse. I agree, but the main challenge overall, I think, is to find a good ways to assess learning.
Thank you for sharing that. And yes, I have other workshops that we talk about doing assessment, but this workshop was targeted on
Yes.
how do we reduce bias? And someone, Dr. Desange said defining what is being assessed was a takeaway, and that it feels nearly impossible to eradicate all types of bias. Of course, we're humans, but recognition and minimization are good first steps. Dr. Liu, I noticed you put your camera on. Did you want to share something with us?
Rosemary, first, thank you very much for, I think, just a very, very excellent sort of session. And I guess it's more of a comment, more related to what you have about what questions remain for further study following the sessions, or what thoughts would you like to share? I guess I'm sitting and wondering, how effective have you been in your efforts in faculty development to actually mitigate bias in learner assessment? And I'll preface that by sort of saying, I've tried for many, many years, and I do not believe I have been very successful at all. I'm not even sure I've been minimally successful. And it sort of struck me as reflecting, like, just look at how many people are here for your presentation. And while we have training for people on admissions committee and hiring committees, I think you're exactly right, right? I mean, what are the requirements for people who are actually doing the grading? And I guess I would begin by sort of looking at thread coordinators and block coordinators and clerkship directors. To me, right, that should be an audience that should be here, right, listening to your session. And so I wonder, I'm just, what shall I say? I feel like you're preaching a little bit to the choir just by the people who are here. And the people who aren't here are the people who need to hear more of this. And yet, how do you build within the organization, right, that quite honestly, what I would say is a requirement. People need to understand this because the grading of our learners are so critical for their, not just, what shall I say, next step in their professional career, but really their own professional development, right, in the long term. And they need to understand that. So that's where I'm coming from. And I guess it sort of reflects my own personal sort of frustration in trying to deal with this.
And because you do a lot of faculty development yourself, you know that we're always preaching to the choir. The people who self-select to come to our sessions are already committed to improving their teaching, or in this case, improving their assessment methods. So, but I feel like if you can get even one person to start thinking more seriously about this, I consider that a success. I'm generally opposed to mandatory faculty development because the last thing we want is for it to be equated to those HR trainings that everybody hates and, usually doesn't pay any attention. You're just sitting there reading a journal article or something while the tape is going. Because if it's mandatory, it's hard to reach people who don't actually want to be there. I do think, though, it is mandatory to take that bias training before you are on the admissions committee or you're on a hiring committee. So maybe there does need to be something. I know Dr. Ho and I were having this conversation just a couple weeks ago, and he said some forms of faculty development have to be mandatory. So I also co-chair the teach team with Dr. No, And we brought it up to that group because that group's supposedly about improving teaching in general in the School of Medicine. And I said, you know, help me. How do I get more people to actually engage in faculty development and participate? We originally planned this session for a face-to-face session, but we had a number cut off because otherwise we spend a lot of money on catering. So we didn't meet that number, which is why we moved it to virtual. And I was hoping we get more people because it would be easier to attend, but we didn't. And I see a hand up, Dr. I'm going to mispronounce your name.
Can I, before you leave
Oh,
that
yes,
topic,
yes.
Rosemary, can I, if I can remember where this is, it's my favorite all-time continuing medical education study. And it was actually a randomized controlled trial, which is rare, is all I would sort of say in education.
Social
And
sciences.
it dealt with physicians who chose their CME and physicians who were required to go to CME. But it wasn't just you had to go to CME. It was a CME required course related to what they were actually doing. So while it was clinical sort of practice, when you looked at down the line where behavior was changed, and I don't remember, but it was several months down the line, the CME that actually changed physician behavior wasn't the ones they chose, because they chose the ones they were already doing. The ones that they were sort of required to go to, but related to what they were doing, were actually the ones that changed their behavior, which for me, I always remind myself to go to faculty development sessions. For example, I come to this one because, as you know, it's kind of an interest of mine. But I make myself go to faculty development sessions that I think I'm perhaps not interested in, but are related to my job. And I often find them the most interesting in a particular sort of conference. So I would like to encourage that sometimes making us physicians, and yes, I understand we like autonomy and it's related to motivation, but sometimes we don't know what we actually really need. Anyway, I'll stop.
No, I hear what you're saying, and I try to do the same thing when I'm at a conference. I try not to just pick sessions that pique my interest, but some that I need to learn something about, even though it doesn't necessarily always interest me, because that's how you learn and that's how you grow. So I don't want to mispronounce your name, but I'm probably going to. Dr. Abralot.
I'll go ahead and say it for you. Abralot. It's actually the way it's spelled.
Abralot.
It makes it a little bit easier once you see it. Abralot. Yes, thank you. What I I'm curious about is when we're looking at LACE, right? A lot of the mitigating factors that you describe are a little bit harder to do in the longitudinal, right? You have the students who are disconnected in different locations. You don't necessarily have some of the benefits that you have in the didactic space or in the small group, like the sim situations where you can have those multiple people look at the same concepts with like the OSCEs, et cetera. So I have to admit, I'm a little disheartened because I'm not sure how to fix the clinical spaces where we see so much of this bias. So what suggestions do you have for those of us who are involved with LACE who see this on an ongoing basis? Thank you.
And I think that it is a challenge, and I absolutely understand that. And there are challenges within the clinical environment beyond what we talked about here today. A lot of faculty, I said, you know, they don't even, we added that not applicable or not observed category, because a lot of faculty were saying, look, I'm grading unfairly because I actually never observed the student taking a physical or doing this. They were only here for 4 weeks and I didn't have that many opportunities to observe them doing these things. So it's like how you address that, I don't know. I wish I had a magic formula. But I think that some of the techniques we're talking about can't be done a lot, but they might be done maybe once a year. Like, could you have a colleague come in and observe something? Could you look at a video and work together to grade something? You know, because you can look at videos from the Sim Center or other places. We've got videos that we use for norming activities. That can be done with LACE preceptors if we get them all, you know, together in one place. It doesn't, you know, there's some things that just maybe aren't practical in the clinical environment, but some of them with a little creative energy, you could make work. And I'm happy to work with you or the LACE directors to try to figure out some ways that might help us mitigate assessment. I think that it's a worthwhile thing to do and might even be a good scholarly project for us. And I see, Dr. Pavala, you've got your camera on. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think like it is good to know that there are a few others in my spot, with these evaluations. I do have trouble completing the evaluations for the medical students because we use the same form for the third year students and fourth year students. Sometimes I'm seeing a student in the first month. They're really good students, but I cannot say that they meet 4 or 5 to get. So everyone wants a 5 to get an honors in that rotation. Same thing with the same thing when they're in the fourth year. So sometimes I feel like they don't need to be 4 or 5 to get into any good residency program. But I feel like obligated to give sometimes because they're not less than anyone that I worked with before. I hope I'm clear. I don't know if I'm clear or not.
I absolutely hear what you're saying. And that's a philosophical discussion that is above my pay grade. And that needs to be happening like at the dean level, which is, I'm of the opinion that it should be possible for a student to get a 5. Other people say, well, if it's a first year, they can't possibly be at the 5 level yet. Well, then the criteria need to change. So
That's sort of, that is what I'm saying. Yeah, criterion, if the criteria are
Right.
changed for their like
Exactly, because
3,
it can be
then
disheartening for a student who's doing their very best and performing at a high level, but because you're judging them based on a fourth year's level, they can't possibly attain that. But again, that's a philosophical approach to grading that needs to be made at a higher level. And I think that it just depends on who you talk to about whether they think, should a first year be able to get a 5? In my opinion, they should. But others say you can't possibly be good enough to get a 5 in your first year. Well, again, that's a philosophical conversation. And speaking of, I just wanted to share with everyone that you went through the Teaching Excellence Academy. So if anyone has any questions, I'm sure that you'll be able to give them some more information.
Yeah, so I agree with you. The student first year should be able to get the 5, but I think the requirements to get the 5, I feel it is different for the third year versus the fourth year. So I like not a lot of difference, but somehow I always feel that so when I'm filling the same form for both of them. So I just use my best judgment to complete them.
You should be grading a first year based on the skill level you expect of a first year. You should be grading a second year on the skill level you expect of a second year. Not, I'm grading a second year based on the skill level I want to see them at graduation. At fourth year. That's an unfair criteria for a first year. You can't expect them to be there right away. But some people feel differently. Some people feel like, well, we're setting the standard for graduation. And so they can't, you should explain to them that they can't possibly be there yet. I don't think that students view it that way. I think students can be very discouraged if they feel like they're making progress, but no matter what they do, they're still at a 2 or a 3. I mean, that's a gut punch for students, especially for medical students. And you've all been there, right? You're all very high performing individuals who, are motivated by performing at the very top of your performance. So to be told, yeah, no, you're not there yet. That's, of course not. You're a first year. How could you be there yet? But anyway, Dr. DeBay, did you want to share something else? I noticed you unmuted.
Oh, no, just because I didn't unmute myself. But for what we are discussing, I think in the graduate medical education, the tools that are recommended by or required by ACGME address that question if we use them correctly, because each competencies are clearly defined. And but I know that often people don't read it, as you said. So
And
it's
again, that's
2
a
or 3 pages
program
on a
level
year.
decision, right? That's a program level decision that has
Yeah.
to be made by the people in charge of that curriculum and assessment process. And that's
I
not,
think otherwise they're pretty well done because it's true each level pretty much corresponds to a year of training, but not necessarily. So either you can be ahead or be behind.
thank you, everyone. I know some people had to jump off. Oh, Dr. Liu, did you have something else you wanted to share? I noticed your hand was up.
Actually, I did. I don't know if Dr. Aberlot is still there, but I wanted to mention that I actually feel very, very strongly that faculty who have opportunities to do longitudinal assessment, quite honestly, in my very strong opinion, I weigh that far more than faculty who see a student for, I don't know, a month, a week, 2 or 3 days. I think faculty who see students over time period, especially in LACE, have the marvelous opportunity to assess growth, right? And are they on a particular sort of growth pattern? And and Rosemary talked a little bit about normative reference and the challenge we have in theoretically a criterion-based, competency-based medical education model. But if nothing more, right, the faculty member can use the normative reference of wherever that student learner was. And over time period, right, you should see growth. And is that growth in whatever area, right, the way you want it to be? And then also in the area they need to improve, is it also where you want it to be? So I think faculty who see learners in a longitudinal framework really have a great advantage. Quite honestly, I weigh them far more than I do sort of, I had them for a week or even a particular sort of month. And I say that a lot in our, well, Dr. DeVay knows, Mark knows, right, in our residency, right, it's the same thing applies. When they're in their continuity clinic, I put so much more weight on that evaluation by faculty than I do on people on a weekly or monthly rotation. So I think LACE faculty have a great advantage and can really provide valuable, not only input to the assessment for the student, but personal feedback to them. I think there's great advantages there.
I appreciate the idea of the growth mindset and keeping that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that is absolutely true. I think one of the challenges for a LACE preceptor is taking the mentor hat off and putting the evaluator hat on. A lot of people in clerkships also struggle with that because I hear them say, well, I don't want to hurt the student's chances for career success. You can't be both mentor and evaluator at the same time. You have to be able to do both separately. And it's a responsibility to grade fairly. And you don't, I understand that you playing a mentor role, you want to see them succeed, but you also have to grade fairly. That's a responsibility you have, not just to the learners, but to the institution and to their future patients. And again, I want to say thank you. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I know people are sort of leaving us. Have a lovely evening. Thank you again so much for giving your time. I know it's one of your most precious commodities, and I greatly appreciated that you shared some of it with us. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.